It started with a challenge, one that no one believed she could overcome. She had always been the quiet one, the girl people overlooked in a crowded room. Not weak, not incapable, but underestimated. In a world that often judges strength by appearances, she was dismissed before she even had a chance to prove herself. From the moment she stepped into that room, she could feel the weight of their doubts pressing down on her. Whispers followed her, smirks exchanged in silent conversations. She knew what they were thinking. She won't last. She doesn't have what it takes. They didn't say it out loud, but they didn't have to. Their eyes told her everything. But what they didn't see, what they never cared to notice, was the fire inside her. She had spent years watching, learning and pushing herself in ways no one ever imagined. While they underestimated her, she was quietly building her strength, training in silence, while they wasted their breath underestimating her. And then came the moment that changed everything. It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about proving something to herself. The task in front of her wasn't easy, and honestly, most people would have backed down. But she wasn't most people. She stepped forward, steady and sure, as the room fell silent. At first, they laughed. Some shook their heads, already convinced she was about to fail. But then, as she took her stance, a shift rippled through the crowd. The laughter faded. The doubts turned into stunned silence. One by one, their expressions changed from amusement to disbelief, from disbelief to shock. She didn't just meet the challenge. She crushed it. Every move she made was precise. Every effort backed by years of determination they never saw coming. And by the time she was done, the same people who doubted her were left speechless. But this was only the beginning, because once the world saw what she was capable of, there was no going back. Her name, once ignored, started to spread. Her strength, once dismissed, became impossible to deny. And the people who once underestimated her, now they had no choice but to recognize her for who she really was. But here's the thing, when you finally prove yourself, the world doesn't always react the way you expect. Some people celebrate you, others resent you. And just as she was stepping into the spotlight, she realized something. Proving them wrong was only the first battle. The real fight was just getting started. That moment should have been a victory, a turning point where everything finally fell into place. But instead, it felt like stepping into a storm she wasn't prepared for. The whispers that once doubted her had turned into something else: curiosity, admiration, jealousy. Some people cheered her on, inspired by what she had done. Others refused to accept it, convinced there had to be some trick, some explanation for how she had pulled it off. She had spent so much time fighting to prove herself that she never stopped to think about what came after. Now, everywhere she went, people were watching. Some wanted to know her story, asking how she did it, what drove her. Others barely looked her in the eye, still unwilling to acknowledge the truth. And then there were the ones who took it personally, as if her success had somehow made them smaller at first. She ignored it. She focused on what mattered, on pushing herself even further. But the more she stepped forward, the more resistance she felt. It wasn't just the occasional side comment or dismissive glance anymore. There were obstacles now, ones she couldn't see coming. Opportunities that had once seemed possible suddenly disappeared. Promises were made and then broken. She'd walk into a room and conversations would stop mid-sentence. It was subtle at first, but she knew better than to ignore it. The same people who once dismissed her were now trying to make sure she didn't rise any higher. But she wasn't built to back down. If anything, their resistance only fueled her. She trained harder, worked longer hours, refused to let them shake her. She reminded herself why she started, why she pushed through in the first place. Still, she couldn't ignore the way things were shifting around her. Some of the people she thought were friends began to distance themselves. Others, the ones she never expected, started to stand by her side. There were quiet moments of encouragement, a nod from someone who understood, a message from a stranger who saw her journey and felt inspired, but there were also shadows creeping in. She started noticing things that didn't feel like coincidences. The way certain doors suddenly closed. The way rumors started spreading small at first, but enough to plant doubt in people's minds. She told herself it didn't matter. That as long as she kept moving forward, none of it could stop her. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about proving herself anymore. This was something bigger, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. And the scariest part, she had no idea who was standing with her and who was waiting for her to fall. She started noticing the shifts in ways that were impossible to ignore. The tension wasn't just in the glances or the whispers, it was in the way people treated her. Some acted like they had always believed in her, as if they had never doubted her strength. Others barely concealed their resentment, as if her success had somehow taken something from them. Then there were the ones who hid their intentions well. They smiled, congratulated her, acted like they were on her side, but something about their words never sat right. It wasn't what they said, it was how they said it. The way they watched her too closely, waiting for a mistake. The way they asked seemingly innocent questions, but pressed just a little too hard, looking for something they could use against her. She learned quickly to trust her instincts. She had spent too long fighting to let her guard down now. So she kept moving forward, focusing on her goals, training harder than ever. But the pressure was different this time. It wasn't just about proving herself anymore. Now there were expectations. Now, people were watching, waiting. And then, the setbacks started. Small things at first. A missed opportunity. A cancelled meeting. A message that was never returned. But then, the obstacles grew bigger. A sudden rule change that worked against her. A decision made behind closed doors, one she wasn't even given a chance to fight. Every time she made progress, something pulled her back. She tried to ignore it, to focus on what she could control. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just bad luck. Someone, or maybe more than one person, didn't want her to succeed. But why? Was it resentment? Fear? Or something deeper, something she hadn't yet uncovered? The more she thought about it, the more questions piled up. And then, just when she started to feel like she was pushing against an invisible wall, someone unexpected stepped forward. It was subtle, a quiet conversation when no one else was around. A warning, not a threat. Just a few words, carefully chosen. Be careful who you trust. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but before she could, they were gone. And just like that, the weight of everything became even heavier. Because now, it wasn't just about proving herself. Now she had to figure out who was trying to stop her and why. The warning echoed in her mind long after the conversation ended. Be careful who you trust. The words unsettled her, not just because they confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, but because they left her with even more questions. Who was working against her? How far would they go? And perhaps the hardest question of all, was there someone close to her playing both sides? She tried not to let it shake her, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was walking through a maze, where every turn led to another dead end. She pushed forward anyway, keeping her focus sharp, refusing to let the distractions slow her down. But things were shifting faster than she could keep up with. More doors closed, more conversations ended the moment she entered a room. Even the people she trusted started acting differently. Some were distant, others overly friendly in a way that felt forced. And then, something happened that she couldn't explain away. A decision that should have been hers was suddenly taken from her hands. No explanation, no warning, just a quiet move in the background, something she wasn't supposed to notice. But she did. And that was when she realized whoever was trying to stop her wasn't just working from the shadows anymore. They were moving openly now, confident that she wouldn't be able to fight back. She wanted answers, but no one would give them to her. Every time she pressed, She was met with vague responses, empty reassurances. It's complicated. It's not personal. These things happen. But she knew better. This wasn't just happening. Someone was making it happen. The weight of it all pressed down on her, but she refused to let it break her. If anything, it pushed her harder. She retraced every step, looking for gaps she had missed, connections she hadn't made before. And slowly, a pattern started to emerge. The people who dismissed her in the beginning were one thing. They underestimated her, didn't think she had what it took. But this was different. This was calculated. Someone saw her as a threat. Someone wanted to make sure she never got the chance to rise any higher, but why? And more importantly, who she knew she was running out of time. Whatever was happening, it was accelerating. And if she didn't figure it out soon, she wouldn't get the chance to fight back. She would be stopped before she ever reached the place she had fought so hard to get to. She could feel it, the tension building, the unseen forces tightening around her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. This was bigger than her, bigger than she had ever imagined. And whoever was pulling the strings, they were ready to make their final move. She had been so focused on looking ahead, on preparing for the next move, that she almost missed what was happening right beside her. The signs had been there, subtle but persistent, the quiet glances, the conversations that stopped when she walked by, the way certain people seemed to be watching her a little too closely. But she had been so caught up in figuring out who was trying to stop her that she never considered something even more dangerous. What if it wasn't just one person? What if it was more than that? The realization hit her like a cold shock, settling deep in her chest. This wasn't just one obstacle, one rival working against her. It was bigger, more calculated. And the worst part? She had no idea how far it reached. She started paying closer attention, watching people the way they had been watching her. Listening, not just to the words being said, but to what was left unspoken. And slowly, pieces of the puzzle started coming together. There were connections she hadn't noticed before. People she never would have linked now standing too close, whispering just out of reach. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. And then, just when she thought she had a grasp on what was happening, everything shifted again. A message deliberate, precise, and meant for her alone. Not a warning this time, but a direct challenge. Someone wanted her to know they were in control, that no matter how hard she fought, they were always a step ahead. But they underestimated her, just like everyone else had. She didn't back down. Instead, she pushed harder, moving faster, refusing to let fear slow her. If they wanted her to break, they would have to try harder. But the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The resistance wasn't subtle anymore. Now it was in the open. Opportunities taken away, people she once trusted turning cold, things being set in motion that she had no way of stopping, and then came the final blow the moment she realized just how deep this went. The moment she saw a familiar face, one she never expected, standing among the very people working against her, someone she trusted. Someone who had been there since the beginning. The betrayal cut deeper than anything else, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't. Not yet. Because now, it wasn't just about proving herself. Now it was about exposing the truth. And whoever was pulling the strings, they had no idea what was coming. She stood there, frozen for just a second, as the weight of the betrayal settled over her. Of all the people she had suspected, of all the whispers and glances she had tracked, she never thought it would be someone so close. Someone who had seen her struggle, who had been there through every step of her journey. And yet, here they were, standing among the very people who had been trying to keep her down. She forced herself to stay calm, even as her heart pounded. If they saw her reaction, they would know she had figured it out. So she did what she had always done. She kept moving forward, acting like nothing had changed. But inside, everything was different now. She knew she was running out of time. The people working against her weren't waiting anymore. They were making their final move, and if she didn't act fast, she would lose everything she had fought for. But she wasn't just playing defense anymore. Now, she had a plan of her own. She retraced every step, looked at every decision that had been made, every opportunity that had disappeared. And she saw it clearly, the pattern, the manipulation, the way things had been pushed, just enough to make it seem like bad luck rather than sabotage. But now, she had proof. The night before everything would come to a head, she confronted the one person she never thought she would have to question. She met them alone, away from the others, giving them a chance to tell her the truth. But they didn't deny it. Instead, they looked at her with something she couldn't quite place, not guilt, not regret, but something colder. You were never supposed to make it this far. They said quietly. The words hit harder than she expected, but she refused to let them see it. She had spent too long fighting for this moment. And if they thought she was going to walk away now, they had no idea who they were dealing with the next day. Everything came to light. The hidden conversations, the decisions made in secret, the people who had been working behind the scenes to keep her from moving forward. But she was ready. She had the truth, and she wasn't afraid to use it when the moment came. When all eyes were on her, she didn't hold back. She laid it all out, the proof, the manipulation, the way they had tried to stop her before she even had a chance. And as the realization spread across the room, she saw it, the shift, the way people turned, the way power slipped from the hands of those who thought they controlled everything. But just as she thought it was over, the final twist revealed itself. Because the person who had betrayed her, they weren't the one in charge. They were just another piece of the puzzle, another pawn in something much bigger. And now, she was left with an even bigger question. If they weren't the mastermind, then who was? She had won this battle, but the war, that was just beginning. For a moment, everything was quiet. The weight of the truth hung in the air, settling over everyone in the room. She had expected anger, denial, maybe even a desperate attempt to shift the blame. But instead, there was silence. The kind that only comes when people realize they've lost control. She watched as the ones who had worked against her struggled to hide their panic. Some still clung to their power, pretending nothing had changed, but she could see it in their eyes. They knew. They had underestimated her, and now there was nowhere left to hide. But even with everything out in the open, she knew this wasn't over. The betrayal, the sabotage, the quiet moves made in the background, it all pointed to something bigger. And the person she had confronted, the one she thought had been behind it all, they had only been part of the plan, not the one pulling the strings. That thought haunted her. If they weren't the mastermind, then who was? And more importantly, what came next? She didn't have to wait long to find out. In the days that followed, things moved fast. Some people tried to backtrack, rewriting their involvement, pretending they had never been against her in the first place. Others disappeared altogether, knowing they had lost whatever grip they once had. And then there were those who had been caught in the middle, people who had stayed silent out of fear, who now stepped forward, finally willing to tell the truth. Piece by piece, the full story came together. The real architect of it all had never been in the spotlight, never spoken against her openly. They had stayed in the background, pulling strings where no one could see. They had let others take the blame, let others do their work, all while remaining untouchable. But now, she knew. And for the first time, they knew she was coming for them. It would have been easy to let the anger take over, to fight back with the same ruthless tactics that had been used against her. But she had spent too long proving herself the right way, and she wasn't about to change that now. Instead, she did what she had always done. She showed up, she worked harder, and she refused to be silenced. And slowly, the balance shifted. The people who had once tried to keep her out had no choice but to acknowledge her. The ones who had doubted her were now the ones watching, waiting to see what she would do next. and the ones who had believed in her from the start, they stood with her, stronger than ever. The fight wasn't easy. It never had been. But as she stood there, looking at how far she had come, she realized something. It had never just been about proving them wrong. It had never been about revenge or making them regret underestimating her. It had been about proving something to herself, about knowing deep down that she had never needed their approval to be great. And with that, she moved forward without fear, without hesitation. Because she wasn't just a name they would remember. She was a name they would never forget.